wanted to share with you today in this presentation is some basic information involved when building custom controls, as well as some of my personal experiences and things that I like to do when building one. So the first thing you might ask is, well, why would I want to build a custom control in the first place? And building a custom control allows you to expand on the web app framework with functionalities that are not provided by the default toolkit. Now, things like these can include graphs or charts, a scheduler control, which I'll show you more of as we progress along this presentation, an HTML editor, which I'll show you in just a bit, or one of my most recent creations, a time picker. So to give you an example, we've got a DataFlex application here, and inside this application we have an HTML editor, and this HTML editor is called the C-Web Frowalla editor, and it is an HTML editor based on the Frowalla editor library. And we've wrapped the DataFlex framework around that. We made it compatible with the DataFlex Web App Framework. And this way we can use it inside our DataFlex web apps. The second thing is that time picker. And again, we have a typical DataFlex view here. And here we have our custom control, which is the C-Web time picker. And this time picker comes with, well, if you click here, it opens up a time picker, and you can select the time you want to enter. And this basically just prevents user error. So those are some quick examples on how you can use a custom control in your applications. But what exactly is a custom control? What defines a custom control? Well, a custom control is a DataFlex component that you can add to your view. And it usually tends to be something visible, something that you can see. Now, at the back end, a custom control consists of two pieces, one part DataFlex and one part JavaScript. The DataFlex side reflects the server-side portion of your custom control. And this is basically a DataFlex class based on a web app framework base class. And here you'll be providing the APIs for your application to work with. Now, the JavaScript side reflects the client-side portion of your custom control. And this is where you'll be implementing the wanted feature using the framework-provided APIs. Usually, you'll be rendering something on screen here. You'll be generating HTML. And what you're building is something comparable to that of a class, but then in JavaScript. Now, before we actually go into the nitty-gritty of actually building the custom control, there is some knowledge involved when doing so. Now, we're going to be creating a DataFlex class based on a web app framework base class. So you've got to have some knowledge on how to build your own DataFlex class and on subclassing. The entire client-side portion will be done in JavaScript. All the logic is JavaScript. And the skeleton of a custom control is basically just HTML, and we'll be performing some DOM manipulation as well. Now, because we'll be expanding the web app framework, you've got to have some understanding of the web app framework basics. Now, if you want to style your custom control, we'll be using CSS for that. And if you want to understand better how the web app framework communicates back and forth between the client and the server, then knowledge on AJAX requests can really help with that. So a while back, I got asked to build a scheduler control for the DataFlex web app framework. And I wanted to use this case as somewhat of an example, maybe a guideline, for some of the things that I want to show you in this presentation. Now, when a request like this comes along, the first thing I do is I determine the initial set of requirements. Now, for that scheduler control, it had to be able to perform the basic CRUD operations, so creating, reading, updating, and deleting events. Should be easy to use and intuitive. And we're going to be building a control that we can fit into several applications, so it should be relatively easy to do so. And to that extent, it should also accept event data in a fixed format, but from any source, because the data could be coming from anywhere. It could be coming from an XML file or maybe a database. You name it, and it should accept it. Because we'll be building it for several applications, we want to be able to tailor it to the look and feel of that application, so it should be flexible and customizable as well. Now, after I determine these initial set of requirements, I get faced with a choice. Do I build the entire control myself from scratch, or do I wrap an existing library? And there's pros and cons to each of these. Now, when we build the entire control ourselves, we get full control over the usage, look, and feel of our custom control. And that's because we possibly get to make it more DataFlex native. We can reuse things like the web button, the web form, or the web list, add our own custom logic, package it all together as our custom control, and that'll be that. Now, the downside to this is that we will probably end up having to build every single piece ourselves. Every component, every bit of logic, maybe the styling is something that we'll have to build ourselves. Now, when we wrap an existing library, we take a JavaScript library that we found on the internet, for example, and we wrap the DataFlex framework around the logic that is provided by that library. We make it compatible with the DataFlex Web Framework. And because we're taking that logic, we don't have to do that ourselves, so we're not reinventing the wheel, which can really save us a lot of time. The downside to this, though, is that we get limited control over the usage look and feel of our custom control. Because the person that created the scheduler library, for example, might have had very different ideas on how a scheduler should look and how it should function. On top of that, there are also no API standards defined for these libraries, so wrapping one library might be very different from wrapping the next. And you might also get a possible dependency on other external libraries, such as jQuery. And when we take jQuery as an example, a lot of the things that happen inside jQuery are things that we also do inside the web app framework. So when we take a library that relies on jQuery, we get possible duplicate functionality that we do not really want. In the middle, like on this thing. This is better. Let's hope it stays that way. So a good thing to note is that with wrapping a library, the pros tend to heavily outweigh the cons in most of the situations, which was also the case with the scheduler library. So I went out on the internet and I looked up some scheduler libraries, and it turns out there's quite a few out there. But in the end, the HTMLX scheduler came out on top for a number of reasons. For one, it had a very clean and simple but effective look to it. And the user interaction was very friendly. You can click inside the scheduler, drag your mouse along to create a new event. You can drag and drop an existing event to reallocate the time. You can double click on an event, it will open up a dialog. You can edit your information, press OK, and you've just edited your event. Everything is done inside the calendar itself, which all leads to a very user-friendly interaction. On top of that, it was very flexible and very customizable. You can really tailor it to the look and feel of your application. And one thing that I really liked, and really like when wrapping libraries in general, is how well it was documented. Pretty much every method, every property, every setting, it was all extensively documented inside their online API documentation. And I often find myself referencing this documentation when wrapping a library. Now, there's one downside to using this, and that is that if you want to use it in a commercial product, you're going to have to purchase a license. So just quickly at a glance, this is that scheduler control as a standalone. We've got several views that we can pick from here. We can navigate back and forth between the date range here. These are our events. Just quickly at a glance, this is that scheduler, and this is what we'll be wrapping the DataFlex framework around. So we've determined our initial set of requirements. We've decided that we'll be wrapping the DHTMLX scheduler. At this point, it's time to do some setting up. Now, I mentioned earlier that custom control consists of two pieces, a part DataFlex and a part JavaScript. So to get started, at the DataFlex side, we'll be creating a package for our class to fit in. And this class will be extending from what we call a web app framework base class. Now, the most common and elementary ones are the CWeb base object, the CWeb base UI object, and the CWeb base control. But if you want to create like a fancy button, for example, you can extend from the CWeb button. If you want to create a form with your own custom logic, you can extend from the CWeb form. In our case, the scheduler is something truly unique within the DataFlex Web App Framework, so we'll be extending from a base object, so the CWeb base control. We'll also have to define our JavaScript class name here. Now, this is not very complicated, but one thing to note here is that the name that we choose here has to exactly match with the name that we define in the JavaScript file later on. So because we're extending from a Web App Framework base class, we inherit a number of properties, and it is here that we get to set some default values for these properties so that we don't have to do that in the object implementation later on. So at the JavaScript side, we'll be creating a JavaScript file. And something that I personally like to do, now this is optional, is create what I call a namespace object. And this allows me to keep everything that I'm doing now grouped inside this namespace object. So everything that's related to that custom control. We'll also be creating our constructor function here, which is what you can see me have done here below. So our constructor function will be creating a WebDHX scheduler. It will take a string name and an object parent as arguments. And we'll also be configuring our superclass, which I'll get to in the next slide. But to configure our superclass, we call on the base.constructor.apply, and then the arguments that we just gave it, so that string name and the object parent. So to define our class in the JavaScript file, we call on df.defineClass. And this is where that JavaScript name comes back into play. So we'll be creating a dfhx.webdhx scheduler. And again, we'll be extending from the web-based control, and this will be our superclass. Now, any functions and logic for your custom control will go inside this define class bit. So our custom control is going to be containing a number of settings. It's going to have to store some data, maybe some status information. And to do all that, to store all that, we use web properties. Now, web properties are much like regular properties in DataFlex, with the addition that the property value is shared and maintained between the client and the server. Now, the engine will generate default get and set functions for you in JavaScript, even though they're not actually present inside your code. They'll be there. And these get and set functions, they are called on whenever you execute a web get or a web set, amongst other times, but we'll not get into that right now. Now, if you want to implement your own custom getter or setter function, you can do so by creating a function in JavaScript, and you'll have to name it set underscore and then the name of your property, or get underscore and then the name of your property. So what that would look like for our scheduler control, let's say we have a Boolean that allows us to define whether events can be dragged and dropped or not within our scheduler. So on the DataFlex side, we'll be creating a property Boolean called pballow_event_drag, and we'll be marking it as a web property. Now at the JavaScript side, we'll also be defining our property. And we do that by calling on this.prop, telling it that it is a DataFlex Boolean called pballow_event_drag, and we'll be default setting it to true. And we do that inside our constructor function. Now, I've also created a custom setter here, and our custom setter is a function called set underscore pballow_event_drag, and it will take a new Boolean value. But instead of overriding the property value with the new Boolean value that we're giving it, we're instead going to tell the scheduler library that we're wrapping to toggle a class called dhxNoResize, and this will tell that library whether events can be dragged and dropped or not. All right, so we've done the first part of setting up. We've added our first web property. But at some point, we'll want to display our control on screen, right? We want to be showing someone something. And to do that, we can use three functions. They're called OpenHTML, CloseHTML, and AfterRender. So what happens is when you enter a view inside your DataFlex application is that the server will gather up all the objects present inside your view. It will serialize them all and send them to the client. And then the web app engine on the client will go through each of these objects. And for every object it encounters, it will go through a render function, which goes through an OpenHTML and CloseHTML function. And OpenHTML and CloseHTML insert HTML elements into your document. And this creates the skeleton of your custom control. And this is how your custom control actually gets visibly rendered on screen. Then after your HTML elements are present, AfterRender is called on. And this is where you can perform some DOM manipulation. So again, what that will look like for our scheduler control. I've created our OpenHTML function here. It's a function in JavaScript. And basically what it does is add a bunch of HTML elements to our document. Now what we're creating here is an HTML container for our scheduler control to fit in. Now at the CloseHTML, we get to add some closing HTML tags. In our case, we've already done everything we need to do in the OpenHTML function, so we can just forward send. This is the equivalent of a forward send, and call that a day. Then in our AfterRender function, so at this point that HTML container has been created and it's visible in our document structure. Now what we're doing here is at some point I call on this.initScheduler, and inside initScheduler I configure that scheduler library that we're wrapping. I set a number of settings and properties, and then at the very end I tell it to initialize itself inside that HTML container. And if you were to take that control as is right now, you were to refine it a little bit and you would drag and drop it into a view right now, you might end up with something like this. Now, some of the functionalities might work. You'll probably be able to shift views. You might be able to navigate back and forth between the date range. However, most of the functionality will not, and that is because none of the logic inside the library is actually linked to the web app framework yet. So how do we make it do stuff? Well, to make it do stuff, we use server actions and client actions. And server actions are basically just DataFlex procedures or functions, with the addition that you can call on these procedures or functions from the JavaScript client by using a method called this.serverAction, and then the name of the method that you want to call on, as well as an array of parameters. Now, your server actions, they can optionally provide a return value, and you have to make them available to the client by using either web publish procedure or web publish function, and then the name of your procedure or function. So for our scheduler control, I've created a server action here. It's a DataFlex procedure. It's called load events. We'll take a number of parameters, so a mode, a start date, and an end date. And what we're doing here is we're setting up some variables, as well as an event array that will be filling and sending to the client later on. And we're doing some date-time conversion here. And I've got an event hook, which I'll get to in just a bit. But this is where that event array actually gets filled with data. We'll then serialize it to a value tree, which is data serialized to a format that both the client and server can read and understand. Add some parameters and send it to the client. Now, that event hook that I just mentioned is something that I personally like to do when I create custom controls, because creating an event hook allows me to define the main universal logic for a procedure myself, and then at the point where it becomes application specific, the developer can just augment that event hook with their application logic instead of having to rewrite the entire procedure itself. So in the case of our load events procedure, the entire procedure of setting up the event array, doing the date-time conversion, the serializing and sending it all to the client, that's all going to stay the same every time. But when it comes to actually filling that event array with data, that data could be coming from anywhere, right? Like from an XML file or a database. And instead of having to rewrite the entire load events procedure, the developer can just augment that on load events procedure, and that'll be enough. Now, the cool thing is that once you annotate this as a method type event, if you were to create an object of this class, it'll actually show up inside the properties panel for this object. So to expose our server action to the client, we use web publish procedure, and we're publishing load events. And I like to do this in nConstruct object because nConstruct object pretty much always gets called on. Now, to call our procedure from the client, I've created a JavaScript function called load data. And when load data gets called, it'll execute this .server action. And it'll tell the server that we want to call on load events, so that procedure that we just created. And we'll pass along a mode, a start date, and an end date. Now, we get to wait for something to return and execute some logic here, but we'll be handling the events that get returned in a different way. So client actions are comparable to server actions. They are basically just functions in JavaScript, with the addition that you can call on these functions from the DataFlex server by using send client action, and then the name of the method that you want to call on, as well as an array of parameters, and optionally a web value tree. And again, a web value tree is data serialized to a format that both the client and server can read and understand. Now, it's a good thing to note that these client actions, they work asynchronously, meaning that if you send a bunch of client actions from the server to the client, that the order in which you send them in is not necessarily the order in which you can expect them to arrive in. So you should never ever assume that the order in which you send them in is also the order in which they get executed in. Now, any parameters that you provide to your client actions, they will be provided as strings. So to call our client action from the server, you might have actually seen me sneak this into one of the previous slides, because at the very end of our load events procedure, I had this line where it said send client action handle events, an array of parameters, and a web value tree, which is our serialized array of events. And handle events is a function in JavaScript, and this is our client action. So what handle events does is take that event array that we got from the server, which is serialized. We'll deserialize it back to an actual event array. Then we'll clear any existing data present inside the scheduler, go through that event array, and add them all to the scheduler. And we do that by calling on the parse method, which is in that scheduler library. And this visually adds those events to the scheduler. Now, as you progress along building your own custom control, you'll probably be adding some more web properties, a lot more server actions and client actions. But once your control is complete, you might want to use it in several projects, which is what we intended to do with the scheduler control from the get-go. And to do that is not very difficult. In this case, the best thing to do is to develop your control in a separate, standalone workspace. And this workspace should only contain the custom control package file, so your class, your JavaScript file, and if you're wrapping a library, any resources required by that library, so the JavaScript files, the CSS files, things like that. Then in your application workspace, you'll be adding the control workspace as a library, and you'll be copying the control JavaScript file to any app.html subfolder of your choosing. Then you'll also copy any other required resources, so CSS files, and again, if you're wrapping a library, copy all those JavaScript files as well. And then you'll be adding a reference to all these files in your index.html, which is what I've done here below. So these are all the JavaScript files required by that DHTMLX scheduler library that we're wrapping, as well as the CSS file. And then at the very bottom, this is a reference to our custom control JavaScript file. And the cool thing is that once you've done all this and you've added this as a library, I get it as well. Once you've added it as a library, you can even drag it to the class palette. And once you've added it to the class palette, you can simply drag and drop it into your view to create an object of your custom control. Now, I wanted to give you a quick demo of what I've been talking about for the past 20, 30 minutes or so, just to give you an idea of what that scheduler does and what it looks like. So I've got a workspace here. And I've already taken the liberty of adding the library, so that custom control that we have, as a library to this workspace. Is this legible at the back, by the way? I don't think I can make this any bigger. And this workspace is our demo workspace that we send to clients that are potentially interested in using the scheduler control in their own applications. Now, I've also already added it as an object to the class palette. So when I go into the class palette and I look under others, you will see that the CWebDHX scheduler is present there. And I can simply drag and drop it into my view right now to create an object of my custom control. Now, you might also notice that I get this little bit of code here for free. And that's because I've templated this inside a DFO file. You can use a DFO file to template pretty much any code that you automatically want to have added when people drag and drop this into a view. And you can use this to guide your developers into how to use your custom control. So in this case, onload events is a procedure you pretty much always have to implement, otherwise you will not get any visual data on screen. Now, I don't have time to fully configure and set up a scheduler from scratch, but what I can show you is what that scheduler control looks like inside a DataFlex application. So I'm going to load up this workspace, and we've got a number of views here, and each view highlights certain aspects of our scheduler control. So when I go into one, you can see that we have our scheduler control here inside a fully functioning DataFlex application. And what we're doing here is not very complex. We're basically just managing reservations for conference rooms. Now, we have several views to choose from, like a day view, a week view, a month view, a unit view, which sends a bunch of different things side by side, in this case, the date and the rooms to choose from, and a timeline view, which gradually progresses through the time. Now, I've set this to increments of 1 day, but you can set it to like 2 hours, and you'll walk along the time in steps of 2 hours. Now, if I wanted to create a new event, I can simply click inside the scheduler and drag my mouse along. I'll get a pop-up in which I can add some information. I'll call this Synergy. I can give it a color to make it easier to find, make it orangey. Click OK, and I've I've just added a new event to our scheduler. Now, if I want to reallocate this event, I can simply drag and drop it somewhere else. I can even shift it to a different room, reallocate the time, so we'll start at 9. I get that pop again. All we have to do is check the times and confirm that it's OK. You can click OK again, and we've just updated our event. Now, I can double-click on an event. I can add a description, for example, or maybe change the color, make it green, very green. And I've just added that event again. If I don't want this event anymore, I can double-click on it again, get the pop-up, click delete, and we've just removed this event from our scheduler. And this all is also reflected inside the database. So to show you that, when I go in here, so we'll see that the execution will stop. That's because I set a breakpoint at onload events. Is this legible at the back, by the way, or should I make it a little bit bigger? It's OK? OK. So when we enter our view, the load events procedure will fire, which will go through the onload events. And I've augmented this with our own custom logic. And what we're doing here is basically we're taking that start date and that end date that we're getting from the client, and which you can see here below. And we're going through the reservations table. And for any reservation that we encounter within this date range, we'll be adding it to the event array. And that event array is a BIREF, so at that point, the load events procedure will pick it back up, serialize it, and send that to the client. So if I let this go, it will have detected a couple of events inside that database, and they'll get visually added to our scheduler. Now, if I wanted to create a new item, I can simply click here and drag my mouse along. Now the execution will stop again. And I end up in this onCreate event procedure. So what happens here is that library that we're wrapping, it has a number of events that it can fire. And one of those events gets fired whenever you create a new event. And we've wrapped the DataFlex framework around that event, so we can send it to the server, at which point we pick it up, and we can augment it with our own application logic. In our case, I've augmented it in such a way that it will pop up a reservation dialog where we can enter information and create a new item. So if I let this go, the reservation dialog will pop up. I can enter the information here again. It will take place inside the conference room. Make it orangey, yellowy, whatever. I'll click OK. And the execution will stop again here, this time in onClose model dialog. And that's because we extended from a Web App Framework base class. So we inherit the onClose model dialog event as well. And here we get the chance to augment that again with our own custom logic. In our case, we're reloading the scheduler. So if I let this go, whenever the model dialog gets closed, it will come here, trigger a reload. We'll get back into onload events. It will go through that reservations table again within the date range, pick up all the present reservations, and once I let this go, our event will have been added to our scheduler control. And that's basically, quickly, how you can use a custom control to visually represent data in a different way, and how you can make interacting with that data a whole lot easier. So we've covered a lot of ground in the past 30 minutes, but really there's a lot more to learn, and I could probably fill an entire day just talking about all the intricacies of the Web App Framework. Now, some things that we haven't talked about is an in-depth look at events, private client properties, synchronized web properties, serializing and deserializing data, which is what you saw me do a couple of times. But there's much more to it than just one simple line of code, and much, much more. Now, if you're itching to get started right now, you can do so because the default web app classes are right there in front of you. Just open up any app.html/dfengine folder if you're choosing in a workspace containing a web app. And take a look at controls like the web button or the web form. These are very elementary, basic web controls, which can give you a good idea on how the Web App Framework functions. And you can also use it as a cheat sheet when creating your own custom control. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. Are there any questions?
So each time that you are creating a new reservation, a new event,
Yes.
You were effectively reloading the entire set of events.
Yes, that's because I made the logic in such a way, but you can also create logic to just add that event to the scheduler instead of having to go through the entire database again.
But that's essentially all dependent upon the host that provided within that control.
Yes, yes. So we just take the events that are provided by that library. I think we've wrapped most of them, and we translate that to a procedure in DataFlex, and you can just augment your own application logic there. That's what we're doing. Anything else? Well, if you have any questions or just want help with anything, I'll be around for the rest of the day, so hit me up if you need anything. Thank you.